Hi, my name is Bruce Bolger, and I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and we're an organization dedicated to helping organizations improve performance through a strategic focus on people, and by that we mean all stakeholders. This educational program today focuses on effective sales engagement tactics. And the reason we got three people with a lot of experience in this field is that we really want to take a historical look. How has the customer changed? How has sales management changed? And what can you, the viewer, learn about enhancing and modernizing and making your sales engagement process as effective as possible? And to do that, we have three people who, again, have combined probably close to 100 years of experience in sales and sales management, starting with Dan Silly. He's Chief Executive Officer of Vendor Neutral, and his company specializes in helping organizations sort out complex technologies to find the right one for their company, especially in the sales and marketing area. We have, secondly, Ira Ozer. He is founder of Engagement Partners. He's a specialist in performance improvement design, planning, and managed outsourcing of almost any type of engagement solution. And finally, Paul Donahue. He is founder of Paul Charles Associates, and he also has decades of experience helping companies improve sales through better communication and management. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. And the first question I want to get at, Paul, starting with you, how have customers changed? Have customers changed in your career in terms of their interaction with salespeople? Are we different today than we were when you started your career in sales?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that today's buyer expects and demands a value-added approach, not just a friendly approach. You know, the days of the just likability driving the bus are long gone. And salespeople need to be value-added. And those people that cannot assess and advise the old-fashioned order takers, they're on their way out. So, you know, earlier we talked about the fundamentals. You got to listen and learn. And that's exactly what today's sales professional has to do. They need to have a plan for every sales call that's done in advance. They have to be equally as focused on being interested in the customer as they are focused on trying to be interesting. And they have to realize that selling isn't telling. So you learn, you advise, you offer a solution.
Dan, your viewpoint on that from your perspective.
Well, again, the benefits of face-to-face interactions are undeniable, but remote selling enables sales professionals to accomplish more in a shorter amount of time for less money. You know, companies therefore shouldn't expect this model to go away anytime soon. The pandemic has really kind of forced us to really look hard at this and, you know, how we sell and how we engage with our customers. We've actually published a lot of content around this. I think since about 2016, buyers have really started to demonstrate or I would say back in 2016, I should say, they demonstrated a preference to, you know, be aided along in their sales cycle. I think if I may not be 100% right on these numbers, but around 65% wanted to be supported by a sales rep. I think 81% wanted to be, you know, supported by a rep during the evaluation phase. And I think about 52% actually wanted a rep present to place the order. Things have changed in a big way. Since 2020, you know, it's flipped. So 65% is self-serve now. I actually think it's a little higher. It's probably getting closer to 75%. And 61% is self-serve surrounding the evaluation. 62% is self-serve surrounding the reordering steps as well. So I think there's just a very significant move in some good ways. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of value in that face-to-face relationship. There's a lot of value in that interpersonal relationship, but I do believe that technology has changed the landscape considerably.
Ira, this self-serve thing really interests me, and because if you listen to these two gentlemen, isn't it maybe because in many cases we don't even trust the salesperson? We don't trust that that salesperson is going to help us make a better decision, so we would just as well do it on our own?
I think that's true, Bruce, to a great extent. It probably started that way, but as Dan has said, sales tech has enabled customers, whether end user consumers or B2B customers, to do more research themselves. So we can Google and we can use all kinds of resources. So Vendor Neutral is a great sales tech industry resource, for example. The EEA is a great resource for enterprise engagement programs, and there are all kinds of places we can go for research. It's really easy. And statistics, as Dan was pointing out, 60 to 80% even of buyers do research online before they even contact a sales rep, and in some cases never want to speak to a rep. So part of it is maybe it started with a little bit of distrust, but I think it's the empowerment that the customer has, and they can define their buyer journey.
Well, based on that, Paul, then how has the model sales approach changed? If we're learning that people more and more, and I do think this applies to millennials, I think this is very much of a generational, there's an impatience. I've got 3 of them, God bless them, and actually 6 and more because of the family effect, right? And people are busy and they don't want to waste a lot of time. So Paul, how does the sales model change? If I've customers that maybe not trust me, they think they know more than I do, or they feel they can do their research. How does my role as a salesperson, let's get more into that listening. How does our role change?
Well, certainly it's a more consultative demand these days. And I agree completely. It's a faster pace. The buyers are much more savvy and much more informed before they interact or engage with a salesperson. And the salesperson has to quickly establish trust, to your point. And the successful ones realize that you don't establish trust by talking at people. So they confirm what the buyer knows, and then they add value. They can find ways to assess situations, overall objectives, and end results that the buyer is trying to achieve, and provide advice, good advice. They can help facilitate or expedite the process of order processing if it's necessary. And some of our clients that serve, say, aerospace industries or other technical industries, those salespeople are almost, they sound more like engineers when they get going. I can see Dan's nodding. And, that's the kind of value that the buyers today really demand. I think that in commodity areas where the products and services are less complex, I think the self-serve model has proved to be effective. But sometimes, just like, what you said earlier, Bruce, about the attention spans, a lot of times buyer attention spans are a lot shorter than they used to be too. And depending on a personal preference, some people would rather do their research and pick whatever they need. Others want you to just tell them. So it's understanding the buyer and being more consultative.
Yeah.
So, Dan, I was just going to ask you, you were going to speak, but let me ask you along those lines. Does the typical, what I often find is that salespeople are scared to do discovery because they're worried it's going to bring up questions they can't answer. But how do you build trust? If you're going to get somebody to listen to you, how do you build trust?
Well, I have to say it's come down to the data nowadays. I think that's really how this entire model is really changing is, it's, if we're going to be engaging and we're going to be using technology to do that, it really does come down to that potential value that we're going to be bringing. This whole trend of data, right? Of like, the insights that we're looking for, the data we need to make informed decision. It's not going away. It's not slowing down in any way either. I see just, every one of our clients is, even if they were looking at engagement tech at one point, they've reset, especially in the more recently, to focus on data because they know how valuable that is around their current customer base. In this current economy, they want to make sure that they're focused on retaining those customers. So again, it's estimated by, I think by 2026, I believe that is the date, that 65% of B2B organizations are going to move from a decision-making driven by intuition to data. So I think we're going to see a big shift, away from this, into intuitive state where we think we know what we need to do next. But we need to take a system-based approach, I believe, which means we need to think of our revenue generation as a bunch of, we don't need to think of our revenue generation as a bunch of disparate people, teams, or departments. It's thinking about it as a cohesive system. It's thinking about our organization as a holistic mechanism that we use for selling.
Dan, that is a headline right there, because, right now, gentlemen, you see if your feeds are filled with tips, like little tips, do this, do that, give them this, give them that. No, It's a system. It takes a system. Ira, you've been observing sales organizations for years,
Sure.
and ironically, in the engagement space. And yet my experience is that still people start conversations by talking. And to me, and I'm a big talker, but to me, you only need to say enough to build enough confidence that the person is uncomfortable to open up and talk, right? How many people in sales today actually do that?
Well, there are two major things. You need the behaviors. So empathy, listening skills, observing, all of those things that, using intuition and things like that. So we're sensitive to listening and really opening up to discovery. But the idea of the buying process, the model sales process really has changed, and it's still changing from salespeople as hunters with a very orderly process to follow. And that's why we're talking, because we want to sell you, versus now we've got to mirror to the buyer journey, not our journey as salespeople.
Yep.
So we've got to really take into account, even though to Dan's point, a lot of companies and sales enablement, we'll talk tech, I'm sure in a little while, are very much data driven. It still comes down to balancing that, with the human element. So we need to really use those human skills too, now more than ever, I think.
Well, does that mean,
Excuse me,
Paul,
Bruce.
that,
I'd
well, let
like
me
to
just say,
pile on. Okay, go ahead.
well, I was gonna ask you, does this mean we have to stop selling and start helping?
Yes, I think that's the fundamental implied message of the consultative selling process. I'm not here to try to sell you something. I'm here to try to help. But to just add on to what Ira was saying, there's a story that goes back some 60 years about Ted Williams, and me being a Bostonian, more or less. He was a baseball player for the Red Sox, in case people in this day and age don't know. And he still holds the record as the only player to hit bat 400 in a season. So the story was that a young reporter ran into Ted at a train station, and the kid was beside himself to meet Ted Williams. And he finally said, "Gee, Mr. Williams, you're the best batter in baseball. You must be a great student of hitting." Ted said, "No, son, great student of pitching." So to Ira's point, to excel in today's sales world, we need to understand buying. And this isn't new. Back in the 60s, there was a recognized sales expert named Fred Herman who made it onto the Tonight Show. And he was famous for this quote. And I think you'll like it, Bruce. His quote was, "Never tell them anything you can ask them." And he was all about the questions. It's just that did not get widespread endorsement. The salespeople traditionally were talkers, as you've said. In the 1950s, a lot of smart people thought salespeople would become obsolete because of the proliferation of television. Didn't happen. 50 years later, they thought the internet would put salespeople out of business. It's put order takers out of business to the point that Dan made. But consultative professional salespeople have a bright future.
And Dan, that's my next question. Sales is a very high paying, exciting field. I personally love it, but you have to love what you sell, right? That's enough.
Yep.
We'll get to that in a minute. But what is the brand of sales today? I can tell you this, none of my kids said, "Oh, Daddy, I want to go into sales." I can tell you that. How many people are fired up today? And I don't want to spend too much time because you have some important questions here, but what's the sales brand today, Dan? And why is it what it is?
Well, I mean, actually, I believe it's been transformative, especially over the last few years. We're seeing a lot of individuals who never thought they were going to be sales professionals coming into the sales profession. Teachers, people working in food and beverage, they saw their livelihood disappear. They saw, their opportunity to earn money, be restricted, and they didn't want that. So they saw sales as an opportunity. I work with an organization, and you guys may be aware of them. It's called Uvaro. They're a training company. They actually train reps, sales reps, account reps, account managers, under a subscription model for both at the organization level and at the user level. So if you're, an ex-food and beverage employee and you want to learn sales, well, you don't have to pay a dime to get all the skills you need. And more than likely, the company that hires you is going to leverage Uvaro to find you. So you're not going to ever have to pay a dime to find that job and to change your profession. So I really believe things have evolved, and I think things have changing. I'm excited about sales. I personally love selling. I personally love engaging and meeting my prospects on that journey. And I think that's how things have evolved. It's more about a partnership, less about selling. I think the word selling has a negative terminology to it, but I believe that that partnership, that loyalty to your brand and to your client is as important as it always has been.
Well, I'm going to switch the order of my questions here because of the flow here, Ira. I was talking about the importance of culture and meaning in the sales environment. And I think that has always been critical, but might be even more critical today. In other words, even if I'm selling ball bearings or diapers or something very prosaic, there's a need for it. The tires wouldn't move in that machinery without a ball bearing. How important is culture and meaning in sales today? And has that changed as the new generations have come in and meaning is more important to them, maybe?
I think in a couple of ways, Bruce. Culture, now more than ever, sales is not just the sales hunter and that person is the king, or queen, but it's a team sport. So we really need to work collaboratively with all of the assistants and technical people and accounting people in a team approach. And so we need a culture that supports collaboration, recognition, mutual respect, and things like that. I think that's a big shift.
Paul, what do you think to that? Do you think there's the importance of culture and meaning is more than it used to be with the post-war generation?
I do. And I think that Ira summed it up very nicely. I also think that from organizational leaders, we need to see a customer-centric culture. It's very difficult to sell if you feel like senior management doesn't value the customer. You need to know that the culture of the company is one that will support the customer, stand behind the products or services, and provide a customer experience should there be need for support or technical assistance or whatever, that people will be pleased with. So I think there's your team approach. I completely agree.
Yeah.
And Dan, this applies to an area that I think you've been involved with, the sales enablement, the buzzword that I think is really critical. And I don't think most people even know what it is. And for those of you who don't, sales enablement is providing, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, Ira, and correct me if I'm wrong, it is the process of providing your sales team with tools that they can use to build trust by being more informed about what they do and being viewed as a trusted advisor. Is that a fair enough definition, Dan?
Well, I was actually one of the founding members of the Sales Enablement Society, and I was actually in the group that actually developed the definition of sales enablement.
Okay.
I think of it a little bit differently.
Then you're the authority.
That's all right, but I think that I think a good debate is important. So I think sales enablement is not an action. It's more about how individuals and resources. It's about individuals and resources. It's about how they are impacted by things like alignment between sales and marketing, or the tech that keeps them focused on their workflow. I believe that in terms of sales enablement and it's how it's evolved. For a long time, we've spent our time trying to define SE as rather than an understanding of what it means to you and me, but really what organizations that are taking a customer-centric and systematic approach to how they leverage their sales tech stack, sell and engage with their customers, they're practicing SE. Whether we're calling it SE, we're calling it buyer enablement or sales excellence or revenue enablement or sales ops or rev ops, you name it, it's all sales enablement in my book.
And it's a system approach then.
Yes, 100%.
And how common, I'm going to go to you quickly, Paul. You've been in a lot of, sales organizations. How common is really seriously strategic and systematic sales leadership focused on identifying our culture, for mapping out what the steps are to a sale, training our people on what they need to do discovery sales, using the best practices we're going to talk about in a moment about incentives and setting quotas. How common is strategic and systematic sales management or sales enablement the way Dan would fulfill it?
I don't think it's that common. I think it ought to be more common.
Dan, what do you think?
I think that it's not common. Again, he nailed it. It's the facts of the fact that there's not enough attention being taken to that process, to the workflow, and keeping people focused on what is going to help them sell more and better, rather than distracting them with resources that take them out of that process or that strategy. So sales enablement is about that cohesive, systematic, as you outlined, systematic approach that begins with an MQL, goes to SQL, carries those insights through the sales cycle to whoever it is, whether it's a sales rep, an account manager, customer support, whatever. But everyone has that visual, that's that understanding of what a good sales cycle looks like and where there are flaws in the process.
Okay, just on the acronym thing, MQL means what? I'm sorry. What did you
Marketing
say?
qualified lead, sales qualified lead.
Thank you.
And can I ask you, Bruce, I'm sorry, and maybe Dan has an answer for this, but one thing that we have seen consistently when it comes to SE and when it comes to sales management in general is a reactive approach as opposed to proactive. If you're systematic, you can be proactive with it. It's kind of what the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, Bruce, has preached with respect to engagement. You can't take an ad hoc reactive approach. It's got to be systematic and cultural.
You need a
No,
plan.
all you have, go ahead, Dan.
You need a plan. No, he nailed it. You need a plan. You got to have a plan anytime you're considering this type of move. If you're looking to transform your organization, start with a plan, start with the stakeholders, understand what motivates them, what incentivizes them, what intent they need, what insights they need, what data they need. There's just so much value in that early understanding and that strategy development.
Well, Ira, and you're the perfect gentleman to ask about this. As you know, a lot of when you're throwing ad hoc things at sales, bright, shiny objects, what's the number one thing? Everybody go, incentives. Oh, I'm gonna hit my third quarter goals. Give them something. And I think the whole concept of systems applies even more. What are the biggest mistakes that you see in sales incentive design, or the biggest recommendations to avoid those mistakes in a nutshell? Because they're pretty simple.
Well, there are a number, but I mean, again, just to summarize, I think there's so many sales enablement technology platforms that you can get tied up in underutilized systems, but it's tech, it's process, and now to your point, it's people. So if we have the right technology and we can lead score and we can really understand what's happening, we're following a process that aligns with the customer buying cycle. Now, how do we get people to be more motivated and engaged to want to do their very best? A lot of companies we need to focus on the top performers, certainly, and have President's Club trips and other recognition. Well, recognition in general is very, very important. Coaching is very, very important. The use of incentives when properly set up is important. And I think a mistake is not also trying to incentivize the middle 60, because the middle 60% can have the biggest effect versus just giving awards to the top everything, the top monthly, weekly sales leader, the monthly sales winner, the quarterly. If you just focus on only excellence at the very top, you really disenchant the middle where the gains can be.
Paul, in terms then, before we move to that really critical issue of forecasting and quotas, in terms of incentives, and it seemed to me one of the very big mistakes that companies use is back to what Dan said, a lack of a system, an ad hoc approach. Do you think incentives by themselves are a miracle worker, or is it incentives plus? What's your view on that?
I think it's fair incentives. And one of the problems with the ad hoc, as you've said, approach is that companies have to keep changing it, because suddenly there's a flaw, and that breeds a lack of trust between the sales team and the leadership. So if you ask me, you try to get a compensation and an incentive plan that is consistent and doesn't need to be changed frequently. And if the organizations would focus more on the profit that's generated rather than the revenue, they could probably create plans that are more win-win. The big problem is when they focus on just revenue, it tends to promote overpaying, in their opinion. And so now they have to change the plan. And I think that Ira hit the nail on the head. You can't just reward the top performers. I've seen a lot of organizations switch to team incentives, which can really make a big, big difference. We've seen data from back from the TQM people that the individual incentives often, give rewards to individuals that actually detract from the organizational success. So that's what we've seen, and it tends to work better.
So I'm going to throw in one little question, Dan, that you made me think of. It's not on the list. Sales and marketing. I have noticed over the years tremendous dysfunction between the two, and silos. Has that changed?
I think what we've seen more recently, and especially at the enterprise level, is we're starting to see sales and marketing becoming one entity more often than not, at least on the organizations that are transforming. They see a necessity in creating that what you asked me about earlier, that MQL to SQL model, right? So what insights are coming in from the website, what insights are coming in from the field, what insights are coming in from outreach, and how is that being managed and surfaced to the right individual at the right time? Because again, if we allow this information to sit in marketing, allow them to raise, the fact that they're doing a great job, that they're identifying all these leads, and that information isn't carrying forth to sales, there's just zero value in that. So I think that we're at a necessity, we're seeing a much stronger relationship between sales and marketing. And I'm actually starting to see some motivation or incentives tied to both sales and marketing, at least at a senior leadership level at the sales, from a sales perspective.
Ira, how about you? Have you seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a confluence between sales and marketing. Some people are calling it smarketing. It's really one integrated approach.
That's great news. We've been talking about that for 30 years. Paul, are you seeing a move toward smarketing?
I think at the enterprise level, maybe. I think there's still a lot of people that don't know the difference.
Yeah, I still see a tremendous separation in many, and by the way, smaller companies, and you'd think it would be the opposite, right? You think smaller companies would have better integration, but ironically, it's often the latter.
Yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up now, this is a really important question because I think it gets down to sales engagement, forecasting and quotas. That's, if anybody hasn't ever had to do that before, you just have to shut up, okay? Because it ain't easy, right? It's very hard. And to set quotas, I don't think there's anything more difficult in business than forecasting and setting quotas. Holy cow. And unfortunately, I think it has a lot to do with sales engagement too. Because if you forecast incorrectly and you set quotas that are ridiculous, I don't care what incentives you have or what communications or training you have, you're going to have everybody grumbling. So, gentlemen, I'm asking you to give your opine on a really difficult, what advice do you give to executives today, sales executives, for forecasting and quotas that makes the employee feel that they have a chance?
Well,
Dan, start with you.
I actually just had this conversation with a client, and I think sometimes you have this carrot versus stick approach, right? And the way we engage with our staff, the way we work with them to develop, a forecast, I think the approach is not the most positive one. I feel that it's most often negative, puts them in a position where they tend to lie. They tend to have to mislead their leadership because they don't want to be perceived as not doing their job. So I think we have to start looking at it in a different way. I think we have to start harnessing, predictive analytics for future decision making. I think it's incredibly important. I think we have to have database decisions that are always more valuable than anecdotal decisions. And predictive analytics can take, your existing historical data sets, and you can run them through statistical algorithms and identify the likelihood for future events, right? So you can start to think about what a forecast actually should look like, or actually could look like, based on data. And I feel that that's what we're not doing today. And I think we're being a little bit too critical, and we're not using technology to our advantage to start to identify some of these opportunities that are before us.
And of course, this is a tough issue. Your views, Ira, on quota setting and forecasting?
I think the ideal scenario is to give sales reps an open-ended comp plan that isn't gamed against them every year. So, and I've worked for a company where, I had a nice bonus based on big sales one year, and the next year my quota was doubled. So the opportunity to earn just wasn't there, and it becomes self-defeating. And you lose good reps game the system. So you really have to, obviously you don't want to overpay for something that was just a market improvement factor or a new product that's so amazing every customer bought it and there was no sales involved. But as you all have said, it takes a lot of thought process of all of the different components of it and the factors on it.
Paul, any wisdom? What about, again, we know a systematic approach always works better than finger to the wind. What advice do you have on forecasting, and especially for companies that don't have the analytics chops that some of Dan's clients might have?
Well, I think that there's a difference between forecasting and quota.
Yeah.
Forecasting implies that there's been some market intelligence brought into it, and this is what we forecast based on what the sales force is reporting based on their activities. Quota is something that is assigned, and as you've said, difficult to calculate. The biggest mistake we see, and it's exactly what Ira talked about, is when the quota comes out, and you said it at the beginning, it's unattainable. And maybe, I've wondered sometimes if it doesn't make an organization sales forecast and quota that's very high. And one of the tech companies we worked with who was very successful, exactly what they did. And they had a demoralized sales force. I mean, whoever as a kid said, gee, when I grow up, I want to be mediocre, but they couldn't hit 60 or 70%. And the frontline managers were telling them that would be okay. So, let's go back. Does the quota have to be something that is there, that is part of the compensation? Once that happens, boy, you have trouble. This is like Ira said, I had a great year this year, now I can't earn. If, as we talked about before, if comp plans, we worked with one organization that did not change their sales comp plan 15 years based on paying on a percentage of the profit. You want to make more money, make more sales. We'll do everything we can to support you, enable you. And it worked out pretty well for them. And, and then just like, the other models, they built it up and then sold it. But during the 15 years that we worked with them, that comp plan never changed. So interesting.
Because the guy like Ira could go, wow, if I really build a successful business here.
Yeah.
So I think the key to that is, and this is really important, is empowerment.
Yes.
To let the salesperson feel that they're building a business and let them feel that they can own that business, and that if they take good care of that business, they can keep that business.
Yes. And if I could add to that, I remember their top salesperson, and he said to me, I've been here quite a number of years, and he was doing what Ira did. He got very, very good. So he sold more. But he said, it was 2 years before I really knew what I was doing. And he said, I didn't know it at the time. Now, I would like to take that number of 2 years and say, well, what's your average salesperson's tenure? Maybe 3 years. So you get somewhere they just know what they're doing and they're out the door. So, you mentioned keeping them. If you can engage them and give them a path to increased earnings consistently, what did you call it? Open-ended sales plans, Ira. I think you've got a good formula.
Now think about that. This is goes back to wrapping up our session. We started by saying that great salespeople have to build trust. They have to be informative. They have to be a trusted advisor. And yet you're now telling me, Paul, and I think we all agree that in many businesses, your salesperson isn't up to speed for 2 years.
Oh, no.
And yet, Dan, the average turnover of salespeople, I think, is 3, something like that. So whether or not that's true, we know there's a lot of turnover. So and I'll leave you with the last question, isn't the concept of knowledge management lost when a salesperson goes? Is that one of the most unmeasured metrics of any company today? How many companies, when Joan walks out the door as that top receiver, they know that they know the dollars that they lost, but what about the intellectual property? Dan, that's my last question for all 3 of you. Do CEOs understand the intellectual property that walks out the door, or are we basically ignoring it in many cases?
Well, sadly, I think they do. I think that's why you hear repeatedly, if it isn't in CRM, it doesn't exist. It's because they want to capture that institutional knowledge. They want to capture that data. They want to capture those engagements, those relationships with the clients. But sadly, most sales representatives and service representatives do not properly update or manage their CRM. They do not leave enough breadcrumbs for that next individual, that replacement. Even the service rep that may be supporting a sale that you made, they don't leave enough information for them to be effective. So I think, yeah, I think from a leadership perspective, there is an importance of having this information. And I still think we're not even come close. I think it's about 20%, if that, surrounding adoption and use of a database or a CRM effectively. So I think we're a long way to go.
Yeah, and think of it, CRM began at the beginning of my career in the 80s.
Yep.
Think about that. Business changes slowly. Ira, your thoughts on this last issue, and then you, Paul, and then we're going to wrap.
Yeah. Fundamentally, salespeople are entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs, so they're intrapreneurs. And if companies treat them as intrapreneurs, they feel like they're owners. They want to contribute. They want to use a CRM system to input data. But you're right. When people leave, when salespeople leave because their comp plan stinks or they're not respected or other factors, hostile environment or whatever, and sometimes it's just they don't feel respected or appreciated. They don't feel recognized. You lose the tribal knowledge they have. So you lose the account knowledge they had about specific accounts. You lose the relationships that they had, and you can't really put those in a CRM system. You can say, hey, here's a guy I played golf with, but you can't have someone just replace the relationship. And one last point I'll make is having a culture of innovation is critical for every company. And the salespeople are on the front lines with customers. So salespeople are taught innovation process, observation, and the discovery process. But think about it in terms of, I'm listening to the customer, but how do we also innovate based on what they're telling me? That's very underutilized and something salespeople could really do to help.
A great point, Ira. And Paul, you get the last word today as I set up our little departure screen.
Well, I think it could be summed up this way. A gentleman who I knew and found to be an expert in process improvement and the old TQM said that you could categorize all the waste that takes place or that exists within a business. Waste of time, waste of capital, waste of material. He said the biggest waste is always lost opportunities. And those are the guys and the gals walking out the door.
Mhm.
And that is not being measured at most organizations, just like we didn't measure defects in manufacturing back in the 80s, and Japanese came along and said, oh, well, we're going to make quality cars, and the rest is history. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Again, this show will be available for the next year until we perhaps ask you to come back next year to update it. We want to thank all of the organizations that help sponsor our educational offerings. And we just want to remind everybody of the information resources, many of them free. We have extensive libraries of information and directories of solutions like Dan's and Ira's and Paul's. And we're always here to help advance the cause of people in business. Thanks again for your time, gentlemen.
Thanks. Good to see you all.
Thanks.